If you've ever received an email that claims to be from some company but it seems suspicious, this video is for you. There are plenty of ways for scammers to spoof email addresses, but here I'll show you how to tell if one is legit using email authentication methods that most big websites use, at least, which are the ones that are most targeted by scammers anyway. I'll mostly be using Gmail for the examples here because it has the most transparent information to see, but if you use other programs, I'll try to show some workarounds with those too. So yes, this is about to be a 20+ minute video just about telling you how to tell if an email is fake, and we are going down the rabbit hole, so buckle up. There's more to it than you think. And remember, you can always throw the video on a faster speed if you want. Let me be clear though, this video is specifically and only going to focus on how to tell if an email is really from the website it says it's from, not whether the email itself is safe or a scam. It's of course a critical part of identifying scams, but if a hacker uses their own domain to send out scams, obviously the tests will show the sending domain as genuine, but the sender is still a scammer. For example, in one part later in the video, I'm going to show you how to view some email checks that Gmail has for verifying the sender. But if you look at them and say, oh wow, they all passed, I guess this email from hacker@stealyourmoney.scam must be completely safe because the Google said so, well, you completely missed the very limited purpose of them. I'll try to keep the technical jargon to a minimum and just show you exactly what to look for, but I will need to explain what some of these things mean because it's important to know why you're looking at these clues. Unfortunately, scammers are smart, so everything I mention will take a bit of critical thinking along with it. So just try to bear with me and also make sure you pay attention to all the steps. Don't just stop halfway through because then you'll think you're safe, but each step will reveal scam techniques that were not caught by the previous. So starting off with step 1, this is going to be a bunch of different ways to check if the from domain in an email is even correct. First with some obvious examples, then with some that are extremely clever. Let's say there's an email with a subject line and content that suggests it's from some company. No matter how legit it looks, the first thing to check is the from address. Now, I know with this we're starting out with the really obvious stuff, but remember, these can be spoofed. However, if it's not spoofed, it is indeed the most obvious sign of a fake email. As an example from my own spam box, this email says Fidelity Investments, but when you look, it's actually a Gmail address someone made with Fidelity in the name. This is why you check this first, because now this case is so obviously a scam that no further investigation is needed. So always make sure the from address domain is exactly what you expect. Many scam emails don't even try to spoof domains because unless it's done right, it's more likely to be caught in the spam filter by doing so. Also, keep in mind, when I say spoof, I mean they manipulate the email address in the actual headers so it actually shows a legitimate domain, even though it wasn't sent from there, which is different from what we're seeing here, where they just use a similar looking one, but we'll cover that later. Technically, this could also be called spoofing, but for the purpose of this video, just know that distinction I'm gonna make. In general, here are some things to look for. They might use a free email service like Gmail, Hotmail, Outlook, or other obscure services you don't recognize as free email services. What you do really need to watch out for though are domains that they bought that are chosen to look similar to the real domain. For example, if they're trying to impersonate the domain paypal.com, they might register the domain paypal-mail-server.com, which some people might just assume is real. This is why I said to make sure that the domain is exactly what you'd expect and not some other similar domain. Also be careful if they use subdomains. Maybe it says paypal.example.com or paypal.com.a-bunch-of-stuff.example.com, where example.com is the actual domain. It could be a scam, not the stuff before it. Nothing before the final part means anything, so always look at the root domain only. Oh, and also be sure to check that they didn't use any letters with umlauts above them or something, or for like Microsoft.com, they could use RN Microsoft, which looks like an M, but isn't, stuff like that. So just check it letter by letter. There is another technique scammers may use, though is admittedly rare, but still possible, which is using foreign characters in the domain that look like real letters almost exactly. And you might not realize that domains can actually have all sorts of Unicode characters in them, including foreign characters that look exactly like standard Latin versions. In 2017, to demonstrate this, one researcher registered what looked like apple.com, but it was not at all. It actually had a Cyrillic A, which was identical looking, but actually resulted in a fake apple.com that was indistinguishable. Because of this trick, web browsers now show the decoded version in the URL bar, which looks like this. That's great for web browsers, but email software might not decode it. And in fact, I tested a bunch of these different softwares myself, and I was not happy with the results. So to do the test, first in Gmail, I basically created an alias that I could send from, which included a Cyrillic A, the same one from that fake Apple domain, in fact. Then I sent myself an email from that address and looked at it using Gmail on desktop, Windows Mail, Outlook, the iOS default mail app, and the Gmail app on Android. With Gmail, it did not display any kind of warning upon looking at the email, nor did it highlight or change the character. However, when I copy and pasted the address into the to field, it did give me a warning, which is good, but it doesn't say which letter or anything. But really, in my opinion, it should really warn you as soon as you have the email open. The default Windows 10 Mail app offered no help. It didn't even warn me or anything. In Microsoft 365 Outlook, it does actually show a message that tells you the email has been sent by an international address that contain letters from multiple languages. But it's not very obvious, and I think they should really highlight which characters it's talking about somehow. As for the iOS Mail app and Android's Gmail app, neither of those also warned me or highlighted the character in any way. So if you're really suspicious about an email but the domain looks totally correct, you can use tools that are out there that will identify individual text characters. You can Google Unicode Inspector for this site as a good one, and if we try that example with the fake apple.com domain, you can just copy and paste it in, and then it says that they're all Latin characters and letters, except the A says it's Cyrillic, so obviously a red flag. You can also Google for ASCII Validator, which will tell you if there are any non-ASCII characters. The standard ASCII character set only contains 128 characters, all just normal upper and lowercase letters and some punctuation, no weird lookalikes. So if there's anything besides those basic characters, an ASCII validator should spot it. But be sure the site is not including extended ASCII, which does have some letters with umlauts, but at least those are still visibly different, just only slightly. So basically, to sum up step one, yes, we are still on step one, you want to be 100% sure, letter by letter, that the domain is exactly correct and the official one. Again, this does not guarantee the email is automatically safe, because it could theoretically still be spoofed. The point is simply that if the domain is wrong, we automatically know it's a scam right away, but otherwise, we will have more to check. All right, now on to step two, where we'll take a look at several separate scam techniques, so be sure to pay attention. The first thing we need to do is look at the reply to field. In Gmail, you can see this by clicking the little arrow drop down near the sender's name, and it will bring up this box, where we'll also look at the other stuff here in a minute. The reply to field is extremely important to know about. This field tells your email program to send replies for this email to a different email address than the email address that sent it. Of course, this does have legitimate uses, but many times if a scammer is spoofing a domain, they have to use a different reply to address because they don't actually have the fake email they sent it from. Here's an example, and just pretend that this one doesn't have a big warning and wasn't caught by the spam filter. At first glance, it looks like the email was sent by loan.uk. But if you look at the reply to, it says some Gmail account. You see, the scammer doesn't have that info@loan.uk email, so they have to use a different email to receive victims' replies at. Also watch out because the reply email might be made to look similar. In this other email, the reply to address is totally different than the from address, but it does use the same name as in the sender name to make it seem less suspicious. Also, sometimes they won't even change the reply to address, but instead in the body of the email itself, just include text that says, send a reply to whatever email. Or of course, a lot of phishing emails don't even try to get you to reply, but rather click on a fake login link or download a virus, stuff like that. So if it doesn't say reply to some other email address, doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. In any case though, if it looks like the email came from an official company, but the reply to is some free email service, it's a dead giveaway it's a scam. And again, later I'll show you some more clues for how to tell if it's a spoof domain like I believe this one was. Another thing I noticed is sometimes it won't say reply to, but just says to. Normally that would be your email address, but if it's some random other email, it might have been forwarded with a list. Like in this one it says recipients, but it could say anything, and that could also be suspicious. Just be aware that might be why. Now, if you're using another email program and wondering how to see the reply to address, I have some bad news for you. I tested most of the major ones: Windows Mail, Outlook, iOS default mail app, and Android default Gmail app. Literally the only one that makes it easy to see the reply to address is the Gmail app for both Android and iOS. where there is a similar dropdown as the Gmail desktop. In all the others, you only see what the reply to email is after you click the reply button, which is really just unacceptable in my opinion. In Outlook at least though, there is a workaround. If you double click a message to open it in a window, then go to File Properties, it will show a space where it says Have Replies Sent To, which is the reply to address. And also below, you'll see it has the headers, which we'll look at later. Now let's do step 2.5, you could say. We're still going to look at the info box in Gmail, and specifically the fields that say mailed by and signed by. These won't always be there, but they can sometimes reveal certain attempts to spoof emails. I'll explain how these are actually determined later though. You can see in this example, it's supposedly from Frank someone, and the email address is support at some trading website. But below, it says signed by some Russian website. Also above, it says it was sent via the same Russian website. If Gmail shows via, it means that the domain sending the email doesn't match the from address. There are legitimate purposes for this. Many websites use mailer services to send out newsletters and stuff on their behalf, but you should still be aware of what this means. And remember, this is in Gmail, but not everything else might show this at all. That being said, this is really important to understand that via thing might not always show up in Gmail, even if the domain and email is being spoofed, okay? It only sometimes shows up. You'll learn why later in the video, but this is again one of those things where if it shows up, it makes it a lot easier, but if not, it's not a guarantee that it's safe and is real. For example, here's one where this is obviously a spoofed email, but it does not show via, so just know that. Now again, there are two that might be here, both signed by and mailed by. For now, just know that they sort of serve the same purpose, just in a different way. And also know that basically every major tech company like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, all of them should have both of these. And of course, they should say that they are mailed by and signed by an official website of theirs. And also, any other major company that's worth their salt in the security should have at least one of these, and again, it should match. If an email has neither, it doesn't automatically mean the email is a scam. But if it comes from a really well-known website that should know better, yes, that is highly suspicious. So in that case, check previous emails they sent you that you know are legitimate and see what those showed. If it is indeed signed and mailed by a domain actually owned by the company, there's a good chance that the email is legit. But there is one more place we can check to be more sure. So on to step 3, we can look at the email headers. Don't let that scare you though, it's way easier than it sounds. You see, there are 3 major email authentication technologies out there, which are SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. You don't have to know what these stand for, but they basically provide a way for people receiving emails to check with a website to see if they really sent a specific email. If a website has it properly set up, which again, all major tech companies do for all 3, it makes it easy for your email client to detect and block fake emails. Unfortunately, not all websites use these, and even if they do, some of them don't enforce their policies, it's called, meaning that the email could still get through even if they fail the checks, but that doesn't mean that you can't still check and see what the results are yourself. So back in Gmail, they make it really easy. All you do is open an email, go to the 3 dots, and then click Show Original. And here you can see the 3 results for the authentication tests I mentioned before, SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. They might not all 3 be there, but that's up to the website owner. So let me give you a quick rundown of these, and then I'll explain these in more detail after. So as I've said, if it's a major website, especially for a major technology company, it should almost definitely have all 3 of these, and they should all say pass. DMARC is the most significant and most powerful because it looks at both the SPF and DKIM records and has its own tests too. So if you check these and they say pass, and you're sure the domain is actually the real one, not one made to look like it, it's probably a legit email. For other websites that are big but maybe not mega corporations, they might not have all 3, but hopefully at least SPF and DKIM, and they both pass as opposed to fail. There are other possible things that it might say, like neutral or soft fail, which I'll explain later. But if the email shows that any fail, I would be highly suspicious. It either means that the mail server was misconfigured, which is unlikely for a massive company, or it's a fake email. If you're using another email program besides Gmail, you're gonna have to look up how to view the email headers in your specific program, and then you can just do a Control F to search for terms like SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and if they're in there, they'll show the same results as would in Gmail. Not every email program even lets you see the headers, but I showed you before how to in Outlook, you just open up in a window, then File, Properties, and then it's down there. You can copy and paste the whole thing or just do Control F right there. I want to be very clear here though. These 3 checks are not, is this a scam tests. Their only purpose is to check whether the email originated from the domain it says, or at least was authorized by the domain. If a scammer registers their own domain and sends scam emails from that domain, they can configure all those checks and it will show pass for all of them, but that just tells you, yes, this was indeed sent by the scam domain. So this is why I put so much emphasis on checking that there was nothing funny going on with the domain name in step 1, because nothing else we do matters otherwise. And I'll say yet again, if the email seems suspicious enough, no matter what, just be safe and assume it's a scam, because you never know. Maybe that person at the company got their email hacked and is being used to send out legitimate emails that are still scams. In fact, I found one very interesting scam email where exactly that happened. So check this email out. It was in my spam box, but it actually claimed to be from a .gov email, which is unusual. I did immediately know it was a scam, just going by what it said in the body, which was, oh, you win $600,000. And I looked at the reply to address, and it was some Hotmail address. So yeah, pretty obvious. But I also looked and saw it said both signed by and mailed by Erie.gov. And in the headers, all 3 passed the checks. And yes, I also checked for any weird characters, and nope, they are all legit. Now you might be wondering how this could have possibly happened. Well, I looked up the person's name, and apparently they're the sheriff of this town called Erie, and that's their site. So I have to assume the simplest explanation, which is probably the guy just got his account password phished or stolen somehow, and someone used it to send out scam emails. And if the scammer hadn't made it so freaking obviously a scam, they probably could have gotten and tricked a lot of people. Just goes to show that no matter what you see, some critical thinking is your last defense. Okay, so now let me get into more detail about some of the stuff you might see when checking these fields, and I'm gonna keep it simple for now, and afterwards, for those of you who actually want to know how these checks specifically work, you can stick around. First, SPF. This helps verify that the server sending the email with a particular domain address is authorized to do so. However, it is the easiest to spoof to pass of the 3, so a pass doesn't necessarily mean much, but a fail is definitely bad and not to be trusted. That means it is in no way allowed to send that email. If you're wondering, wait, how are the security tests spoofed? Well, we'll talk about that later. If it says neutral, it's basically the same as not being enabled at all, which is just bad policy and also pretty suspicious. A soft fail is the same as a fail and is highly suspicious, and just means that the domain owner said, even if this check fails, accept the emails anyway. It doesn't 100% mean it's fraudulent, and could easily just be because the mail server is misconfigured, especially if they're using a third-party mailer service, but you still probably shouldn't trust it too much. The only exception might be if there is also both passing DKIM and DMARC records, despite being a soft fail. Next, DKIM. This tells you that the email has not been altered in transit and was written by who it says it was. But again, you still want to see DMARC with it because yes, it could be a passing DKIM record, but that record could be for a site that is not even matching the from domain. So it's not a 100% guarantee, although I will say in my experience, it seems like DKIM spoofing is quite a bit rarer than SPF. But you might see a lot where it says fail and they attempted to do it. But if you really want beyond a shadow of a doubt, DMARC is what you have to look for. A pass technically should mean the email was not altered and also will tell you who signed the message with an encrypted key. In Gmail, it'll actually say with domain and then the website. If you're using Gmail, here's where you really do have an advantage because it allows you to easily see the true signer of an email. And with this information shown, you can sort of do a DMARC-like test yourself by looking and seeing if the domain here is the same as the one in the from sender. That's called alignment. That's also basically what DMARC checks for both SPF and DKIM. However, this is really important. If it fails, then don't even bother checking if it matches because that's faked anyway if it fails. Only bother checking for a match if it passes, because if it passes, that means there was a legit signature somewhere and you just want to make sure that legit signature comes from the actual sending domain. In other words, if it passes, then yes, you can see the true signer of the email. But if it fails, that means that they said they were signing for that domain, but they failed, which means you can only know that that is not the domain it came from. And if you're not using Gmail and using a service that doesn't show you all this information, then really you just have to kind of rely on whether there's a DMARC record, and if there's not, then you don't necessarily want to trust it if it's suspicious. Now, if it passes, but the domain is not the same as the from address and not an official site by the company, it means they sent a valid certificate, but it has nothing to do with the site it says it's as being from. And by the way, if the signing domain is not the same as the from domain, whether fully legitimate and authorized or not, that's actually when you see the via thing show up in Gmail. But again, that only happens if it's a valid passing signature. Like in this example, the domain is obviously spoofed, but because it failed the checks, Google doesn't know where it came from, so it can't tell you, and it does not say via. So do not assume that it isn't spoofed just because via isn't there. You always want to make sure that there is an actual valid and matching DKIM or SPF record. Next, if you see fail, obviously don't trust it because it means either the email was altered in transit somehow or could be faked, and at best is a bad configuration. None means the sender didn't sign it, which basically means nothing. Policy means it was signed but was not configured in a way that is acceptable, so basically useless. Neutral means it's either not signed or had a syntax error, so really the only one you can trust is a pass. So basically, from my understanding, even if there is not a DMARC record, if DKIM passes and the signing domain is an official one for the correct website, that should be fine, because that's the big thing that DMARC checks for anyway, called alignment, which we can just see here ourselves. Also be aware that a lot of big companies have free email services that scammers can use to send out scam emails. For example, Microsoft. They have one through Office 365, and I believe that sends out one via onmicrosoft.com. So if you see one that says onmicrosoft.com, just know that's not really from Microsoft. It's someone could have set that up and sent out emails via that, and someone might say, oh, well, it was sent via Microsoft. It must be trustworthy, but no, anyone could have really done that. So don't necessarily trust it if it's not matching the domain that was sent. Speaking of DMARC, I kind of already just said what it does. It looks at the SPF and DKIM records and makes sure they were actually testing for the domain that is shown to the user in the from field and not some other random domain. Because obviously it would be useless if a scam email claiming to be from paypal.com goes out, but includes SPF and DKIM records for scam.example.com. Those two might pass, but have nothing to do with PayPal.com. That's why DMARC is so critical. Oh, and by the way, those mailed by and signed by fields in the other Gmail window basically correspond to the SPF and DKIM records as passing. If DMARC passes, it means you can be pretty darn confident the email is at least not spoofed or faked. But again, make sure you check the from address for any lookalikes. But if it has DMARC and fails, I would be highly suspicious. It could be a bad configuration of the email server, or it could be a more sophisticated spoofing attack like this one that I actually found, which claimed to be from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, but obviously wasn't. With this one, you can see that the headers show the FPS actually passes, but the DMARC fails. And on the email page, you can see it says mailed by and then this bounce v2.internet, whatever this is. And here mailed by corresponds with the SPF record. But this is not imf.org. This is some random website. That's why it says via there. Therefore, obviously this SPF pass is actually a pass of the internet domain, not the IMF. So they actually spoofed the headers to tell email clients to check SPF for a domain that is not even the IMF. Luckily with this though, IMF does have DMARC, so we can see that it obviously is fake, but even if it didn't, now you can go look and see if the mailed by or via thing is there, and if it's another domain, especially if it's looking suspicious, could definitely be a scam. So by now you should have a much better understanding of what you can look for if you come across an email that you suspect could be fake, but might not be very obvious on the surface. At this point, you'd only have to worry about a situation where the company's servers or someone's email was hacked to send it out, which is obviously a possibility, but less likely. And now I'll go a bit more into detail about how exactly the different authentication records work. With SPF, that stands for Sender Policy Framework. It is meant to specifically just check that the return path in the header, aka the original sending server, is allowed to do so. You see, whenever an email is sent by anyone, it includes a bunch of info as you'd expect, like the email address and domain it's supposedly from. But anyone can just code their email to say, yeah, I'm this person, so how can you tell? Well, what a website can do is create an SPF record in their public DNS records. These are visible to anyone who wants to look them up. And they also tell web browsers stuff like where their web server is. The SPF records basically say only servers with these specific IP addresses are authorized to send emails with my domain name on them. So if you get an email claiming to be from PayPal.com, you or your email program can look at the DNS records PayPal.com publishes and see if the server this email came from is on that authorized list. If it matches, it's a pass. And if it fails, the website can either call it a fail, which tells you to reject any emails that do not match, or a soft fail, where the website tells you, even if this doesn't match, just accept it anyway, which is often used during testing, but is kind of useless to keep on permanently. Next is DKIM, which stands for Domain Keys Identified Mail. This time in the website's DNS record, there is a DKIM record containing a public encryption key that anyone can see, while the official sending server keeps the private key no one else can see. These encryption keys are created in a very special way, such that the private key encrypts data that only then can be decrypted by the public key, and also the other way around, where the public key encrypts data that can then only be decrypted by the private key. This is called public key encryption, and specifically asymmetric encryption. So what happens is the sending server takes the contents of the message before it sends it out, then hashes the contents of the message and generates a unique string. Now, very quickly, hashing just uses an algorithm that generates a unique string from some data, and only that exact data will generate that string, called a hash, and also the same algorithm will always generate the same hash for that same data. It's just an easy way to tell if a file or some data matches the original without even having the original. Now, the reason you have to encrypt the hash is because a scammer could just hash some scam message and send it along. But if the authorized server encrypts the hash with the official private key, then you as the recipient get the message, generate a hash of the message's contents, and then you take the encrypted hash that was sent along with the email and decrypt it using the public key published on the official site. If the hash you generate yourself matches the one you decrypt that was sent along, you can now be certain of two things. First, that the message was not changed, and also the website whose public key you used to decrypt it must be the true sender. Because the way the keys work, you know that anything you decrypt with that public key must have been encrypted with the private key that you know only the real website has. So it kind of does the job of SPF as well. Finally, how DMARC works, and it's easier than DKIM, trust me. DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. I sort of already touched on DMARC before, but this is necessary because the major weaknesses of both SPF and DKIM are, from my understanding, that someone could basically send along an SPF and DKIM record that has nothing to do with the email the human recipient sees as the from address. So people quickly realized, wait a minute, we need to make sure the SPF and DKIM are actually authenticating the address the user sees, which is basically the whole point. So if a website enables DMARC, which again is listed in the DNS records, it checks this and also lets the website owner say what should be done about emails that fail DMARC. The main policy options are to do nothing, quarantine or send to spam, or reject completely. There's also options for whether this applies to subdomains or not. At this point, you might be thinking, wait a minute, if we have all these layers of security out there, why do we need to go through and check so much stuff ourselves? Shouldn't all the spam get caught? Well, no, not at all. According to the site spf-all.com, which is tracking SPF statistics, of the 140 million domains they checked, 80% of those domains had no SPF records at all. An SPF record is usually considered the most basic, bare minimum security. Now, not every domain necessarily is used for email, and the biggest sites definitely use it, but still. But here's more. Of the 20% that do have SPF, only 32% use the strict method, saying to outright reject failed matches. Another 33% use a policy that literally does nothing and is equivalent of not checking at all, and a further 33% use one that's soft fail, which may or may not cause a rejection depending on their DMARC settings, if they even have that. Oh, and the last 1% have a record that explicitly says, yeah, anyone can send emails on our behalf, and you should just accept all of them no matter what, which are all either terrible mistakes or their goals are just beyond my understanding, because that is literally giving anyone permission to impersonate your domain. Also, according to data by a company called Farsight, only about 2.7 million domains use DMARC. That is a lot in absolute terms, but not compared to how many domains are out there. If the other statistics are right, then there are 26 million domains that has FPF records, so presumably are sending out emails. But then only about 10% of those use the authentication record that's the best. Oh yeah, and of those that do have DMARC, more than half don't even have an enforcement policy, which makes it almost pointless. So that should answer the question of why bother checking yourself. While many websites have these records, there are plenty that don't, and even many that do don't have enforcement policies to tell your mailbox software to block failures. So then it's just up to your email software spam filtering capability. I guess the one good thing is that scammers are probably most likely to try and impersonate the biggest sites, which are also the most likely to have the most thorough security records in place. But by now, you should hopefully never fall for a spoof email again. Of course, if the domain address turns out to be legit, you better make sure you still know and trust the domain in the first place. That's all up to you though. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys want to keep watching, the next video I'd recommend is talking about some of the newest scams this year and that will probably be around for a while. So click on that right there. And also if you guys want to subscribe, I make a couple new videos a week, so it should be worth it. So thanks so much for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next one.